Fantastic. Well, great. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I know you're all busy. We've reached that point of the semester where we have a lot going on. So I do appreciate you taking the time to join us. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Colin Clarke, a terrorism and transnational organized crime expert, actually one of the world's leading ones. Is widely published in this area, including the book that we're going to talk about today and raffle off, and at the end, the Mediterranean connection, based on some work that he did that I'll talk briefly about, but then we really want to have a moderated discussion. So I have a couple of questions that I have here, including some that Ryan submitted online. And then we'll open it up to the floor. Yes, he's going to talk a little bit about his book, but really Colin can address so many different, if you've seen him on CNN, you know, he can speak to so many different issues. So don't feel compelled to talk just about the book. And the other thing he told me before was, he's a GISTman, right? So not too long ago, he was sitting out there. He was in our PhD program. Colin got his PhD here, focusing on security and intelligence studies. He worked closely, not with me before my time, unfortunately. He worked with our friend and colleague, mentor, Dr. Phil Williams, who wanted to be here today, but just unfortunately was not able to make it. So the point is, he's been where you are, and he really has a ton of connections in the DC and the think tank world, and can share insight on, I'm sure, some of the questions that you guys have in your minds about now, like, what now? What now? We're concerned about some recent developments, so we'll make sure we save a little bit of time to talk about that.
Please, happy to talk about career, prospects and all the other issues. No holds barred.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's get started then. Go into all the details on the bio. Okay. So one question that I had, as I read through the book was, you, Phil, and Jason make a useful distinction, I thought, between trafficking and smuggling. And I'll admit, I've worked in that field. I never really thought about it the way you guys describe it. So I think I have a tendency just to use them as synonyms.
Sure.
But they're not. So can you help us understand what is the difference between smuggling and trafficking?
So smuggling is really when you're talking about kind of illicit goods, almost for an illicit purpose, right? So taking things like cigarettes, for example, which you can buy in a store, but when you then take them and move them from North Carolina to Michigan and resell them, right? There's an act of smuggling this illicit good for illicit purposes. Both Hamas and Hezbollah were known to do this in the United States, where they were running that exact route, North Carolina to Michigan, and beating taxes. And it might seem marginal, right? Of like, how much are you actually making? I grew up in New York, on Long Island, and we had a lot of bodegas. Used to be able to buy what they called Lucy's, which were cigarettes for a quarter, right? So I don't know how much cigarettes cost back then, but 20 in the pack, you sell them. And so, again, it seems really small, but if you're a terrorist group, it's also low stakes. What's the penalty going to be? So illicit goods, for illicit ends. Trafficking is when you're talking about narcotics, right? And smuggling things that we know are illegal. The FBI looks at it slightly differently. The Bureau has described it to me as smuggling is the act of moving the product, and trafficking is when an illegal kind of element takes place, right? So, moving something from point A to point B, even if it's illegal, you can smuggle a person. You might be trying to help them, but when you then try to force them into indentured servitude or forced labor or prostitution, etc., that becomes an act of trafficking.
So the heart of the book is a comparative analysis looking at similarities and differences in trafficking and smuggling activities between different countries in North Africa, Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, and so forth. So the question that I have for you, Colin, is does this comparison, because it's like my PhD class, we would talk about this as a comparative case study. And so we were actually talking about this last week in class, and how we do these comparisons to try and eliminate potentially confounding or independent variables or factors, right, that may cause it. So the question is, did you, by doing that comparison, identify factors that explain why some of these countries might struggle more than others with smuggling and trafficking?
Yeah, it's a great question. If I were doing this as an academic exercise, if I was writing this up for a journal article or an academic press even, we probably would have undertaken a different case selection methodology. I'll take a step back and share that the book originated as a report for a client. And so the client had particular interest in this region, right? So we would call that as academics cherry picking. You just picked the 5 cases. They didn't you didn't go through a rigorous methodology. We honestly didn't think that we would ever get this published as a book. Just on a whim, one of my colleagues said, you should ask the sponsor if we could publish this as a book, because when we started on the report, we weren't expecting to write 80,000 words. It came together quite nicely. One of the reasons why I think the report grew so long was we initially planned to go and do interviews with government officials, border security agents in each of these countries. And then COVID happened. And so we had this big pot of money set aside for travel that we could no longer use. So we expanded a research team. And this was largely the result of desk research with some interviews mixed in. And here's another way that this would be different than purely academic research. If you were doing this for your PhD dissertation, you'd have to go and go through Human Subjects Protection Committee, right? You'd have to go through your due diligence. Because we were writing for a trade press, we didn't have to do that. We could get a little creative. And so we tapped into a human intelligence network that we run informally in that part of the world. And so we were able to have folks that are in our network do interviews with individuals that were actually trafficked. You'll see this in the Libya section, and send that back to us in Arabic, which was then translated, and parts of that were captured in the book. Really, one of the most important insights that I think that we gleaned, and we're a bit ahead of the curve on this, was we identified 2020, 2021, a real change in what was happening in Libya, where it had moved from a smuggling and a trafficking economy to a detention economy. And so African migrants, mostly African migrants, folks from Sudan and Eritrea and elsewhere trying to go into Europe, were then being held in Libya by various militia groups and detained. And their captors were making money from that, right? And if you could open up that can of worms. You can go look at what Italy's counter-trafficking policies look like. They're not pretty. It's essentially paying off some non-state actors in Libya to kind of contain the mess. But I can guarantee you this is stuff that's going on in other parts of the world as well.
So let me get this straight. The Italian government was paying the Libyans to hold these?
So Libya, as you know, is a split, right? There's no official Libya government. There's Haftar, and then there's Tripoli. It was payments being made toward the Libyan Coast Guard to essentially prevent people from leaving Libya to get into Europe. That was part and parcel of the strategy.
Wow, fascinating. Sounds like a great book. Okay, you did hashish trafficking in Morocco, and this is from my war on drugs class. I see you and cigarette smuggling in several Maghrebi countries. What about Captagon? Right? Captagon has received a lot of attention in the media and the press over the last few years. Middle East trafficking activities. But I don't know if you guys came across that ever.
So Captagons, I think the explosion and the proliferation of Captagons is a more recent phenomenon. And for anybody really interested in this topic, I'd refer you to my friend Caroline Rose. She's at New Lines Institute. This is really her bread and butter. She is one of the world's leading experts on this, and you probably saw her all over the news after the fall of the Assad regime, where within days of the collapse of the regime, there started being discoveries of massive Captagon facilities, right? The government has essentially turned Syria into something of a narco state. I think Bashar's brother, Bakr, was in charge of running that industry. Captagon had it, but was still more in its kind of nascent stages when we were doing the research. I think by now, it's infiltrated certainly parts of North Africa. We've seen some reports of it amongst fighters in Sudan and elsewhere. So it's really just add another kind of illicit substance now, in addition to hashish, in addition to some of the other things that North Africa is known for. And it just makes the situation more complex. It ups the ante for issues like corruption. Your last question was, what were some of the kind of factors that we saw common across all these cases? Because again, without going through, standard case selection methodology, we're saying here, we're interested in this geographic block right here. But we weren't necessarily comparing like with like, right? Because Morocco was very different than Egypt demographically, right, in terms of capabilities, right? All these, but we did find that one common factor throughout all was quite high levels of corruption, to no surprise, right? In many ways that breeds organized criminal activity, something that I've long looked at. I think there's a real link there with terrorism as well. But I spent time in Afghanistan, actually when I was a student here, PhD student here, and working for the RAND Corporation, spent time in Kabul on a counter-corruption task force. And again, if you know the situation there, the Taliban, opium trafficking, corruption through the roof. Working on a counter-corruption task force in Afghanistan was something of a thankless task, I would call it. You get sent over there, you're like, okay, yeah, right.
So that's interesting. You found this one factor, corruption, to be common across the cases. But as I also remember from your cases, you found different, again, what you might say, measures or levels of criminality, like smuggling and trafficking in those cases.
Exactly.
So in the cases that had lower levels of smuggling and trafficking, did they also have lower levels of corruption, or was it about the same?
It varied, but in the cases where you had lower levels of smuggling, you also had more stale and more robust border security.
Okay. All right, so there's another factor.
Typically wielded with a heavy hand, and that was the case, like for example in Algeria, where when we were prepping to, before COVID hit and travel shut down, we were having the most trouble with, finding folks in Algeria to talk to us about this.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where there's a tendency or a reluctance, I would say, for someone at that level, border guard level, to report bad news up the chain, right? There's a great book called Armies of Sin by Ken Pollock. It's a study of paramilitary, and this is a huge factor in why these militaries fail to function effectively, is because nobody wants to give news to their superior, so they pass along good news. I think about how quickly the Assad regime collapsed, and everyone said, wow, this is crazy. But it had been a hollow force, right?
Yeah.
But if you're a lieutenant and you go to the general and tell them how terrible things are, it's on you, right? That's the way that these military cultures have developed over time. And so everybody just paints a rosy picture, and then at the end it becomes something of a Potemkin force. Because when pushed even by a violent non-state actor like HTS, the regime collapsed in a matter of days, if not weeks.
Yeah. And the other interesting thing about Syria, relevant to our audience, is, as you know, how in recent years, Captagon has become increasingly important in the Assad regime.
Yeah.
And But at the end of the day, it didn't really help them much as things were collapsing around.
Sure. We now see, Lebanese Hezbollah very closely linked up with that. So another area that I think about a lot is the crime terror nexus, right? To what extent, and that's a whole other book in and of itself, right? What constitutes a nexus? This is a debate I used to have with Phil Williams, who was who had, Dr. Kenny had mentioned was one of the authors on this. How much cooperation do you need between a terrorist group and a criminal group for you to reach that level of a nexus, right? Versus maybe a temporary marriage of convenience or a series of one-offs. What really, and he's very skeptical of the notion, I think more so than I am.
So what's your take? What is the...
I'll give you an unsatisfying answer. It depends. and I'd say that kind of not trying to be a wise guy, but one of the areas where I think it really manifested itself, I spent a couple of years really, really closely following the foreign fighter flow of fighters from Europe, not just Europe, but working closely very Europe, to the Islamic State. And they have really perfected the notion of the nexus because they were recruiting from the criminal underworld in Brussels, in Paris, and elsewhere. Why recruit criminals? They come with a particular set of skills, right? That come in quite handy. They've been in prison. And in fact, these are people that had went into jail, many of them, I'm generalizing now, for selling drugs, for doing things quite un-Islamic. Many of them radicalized in jail and came out with a fervor, an ideological fervor for ISIS, and this skill set that served them well on the black market, in the underworld. And this is another area where I think there's a lot of hyperbole surrounding ISIS, but here's one area where they really nailed it, was their recruitment campaigns. Because they put out a whole campaign that said something along the lines of, sometimes the worst pasts make for the best futures. So what are they doing there? They're appealing to this person that, wasn't living their life as a good Muslim. They were drinking, they were having premarital sex, selling drugs, and now they're calling for this purification or redemption. And that actually was really effective and resonated with a lot of Europeans to come over and join the caliphate.
Yeah.
Think of if you think of the Bataclan attack, November 2015.
Yeah.
Some of the people involved in that, exactly. Salah Abdeslam, Abdullah Hamid Abu, these were lifelong criminals, that then became very, very committed jihadists.
Yeah. Great points, thank you. Let's, we could go all day back and forth, but I do want to open it up to the floor, and we have a great group of students here. Would love to hear any questions, either related to what we've been talking about or more general security issues. As you ponder that over, maybe I'll ask your question. Ryan submitted a couple of questions online. It's okay if I ask one of those?
Yeah,
okay,
absolutely.
great. So, in your opinion, which sectors of the economy may be most vulnerable to exploitation from malicious actors? And how do weak institutions play into this dynamic?
Is it of the economy? So the illicit economy or the licit economy, or both?
I was thinking more about the illicit economy, because at some point, the illicit economy is going to have to make contact with the illicit economy. And so I was thinking in terms of smuggling and what have you, this generates money at some point, and that money must be moved through the illicit economy. And I was thinking, where in your opinion might those weakest links might be?
So I'll give you an example of each.
Yeah, perfect.
I think one, crypto is a place to look now, which is legal,
Yeah.
right? But it's increasingly becoming an avenue for illicit activity, money laundering, etc. The October 7th attack, the Iranians transferred large sums of money to Hamas through crypto.
Wow.
Right? There's a major lawsuit right now in the press against the crypto company for allowing these transactions to happen. Jessica Davis, who's a Canadian researcher, is really, really good on this. She runs Inside Intelligence. For my money, she's probably the best in the business of looking at how crypto is being used and abused by various actors. On the purely illicit side of the house, we unfortunately have a real-time case study on our hands. As USAID funds dry up around the world, that's going to push people from the formal into the informal economy in large numbers. It's going to be a boon for criminals, terrorists, insurgents, militias who fill that void. And you know, I've had some people just in the last few days push back, which I like. I mean, I like people that play devil's advocate. They said, so what? Why do we care if there's more illicit activity in Africa? Well, it's not just the money that flows into these groups. It's also the legitimacy that they get for basically playing a function that the state is no longer playing, right? Or that humanitarian actors are no longer playing. And with that legitimacy comes durability. Look at Hezbollah. I know that they've been smacked around quite a bit over the last 15 months and are probably at their weakest that they've been in a long time. But this is a group that's embedded itself in the social fabric of Lebanon because it's played a role that the state was either unwilling or unable to play, right, in parts of South Beirut and other parts of southern Lebanon. Now, there's a million other factors that go into that. In 18 years of the occupation, 1982, 2000, many other things. But it was that kind of gap in state capacity, right, these trappings of state failure that allow non-state actors to come in there. Other evidence from Pakistan after the 2015 earthquake. Who was on the ground helping people? It was Lashkar-e-Taiba, right? So I think there's going to be a lot, and there's a lag effect to this. We're not going to be able to kind of track it in real time, but I guarantee you if we look a year from now at this decision, downsize or totally abolish USAID, there's going to be some really, really bad second-order effects.
I want to piggyback. I mean, we've been talking about state failure for so long. Like, I remember when I was sitting at it, right? Rockford, remember the 90s, right? When I was a graduate student, we were talking about state failure, right? Here we are, 30 years later, we're still speaking about state failure. Is there a solution to this?
Look, not all non-state actors are bad. You know, we're planning a conference right now in the Gulf for late April, and the theme is the impact of non-state actors on global security. Goldman Sachs is a non-state actor. I guess I shouldn't use that for the building. Yeah, like financial firms, the International Red Crescent, right? Like these are non-state actors. I tend to focus on VNSAs, violent non-state actors, but there's a range of non-state actors out there that could and are forces for good in civil society. So it's about thinking creatively, trying to, patch these things together. But this is a trend, as you mentioned, that's been identified going back years. And it's a really fascinating concept to think about the erosion of the Westphalian state, right? And what takes its place. I always think these things exist on a spectrum, right? From whatever you want to call Somalia right now, right? So if you look, foreign policy used to do the failed states index. Now I think it's the foreign policy and fund for peace, right? But Somalia was kind of always up in that collapsed state category, like at the highest possible level. But now we've got whole regions that are heading in that direction. Look at the Sahel. That's one. So it actually reminds me a lot of what I studied here. I mean, my major field was international security, and my minor field was international development. And I think those two go together quite well when you talk about, from fragility to shrinking.
And we still have both, international security and international. Okay, great, excellent. Would love to throw it out to the floor. And maybe begin by identifying yourselves for our guest. I saw this gentleman's hand first, then I see Tyler and okay. Sir?
Hello, I'm Christopher Silva. I work with Center for International Studies lab in sociology. I'm not involved at all in PIA. I call myself a recovering political scientist, masquerading as a sociologist.
Recovering political scientist?
Recovering political scientist, yes, masquerading as a sociologist. So your data collection actually stood out to me because it involved, at least originally you said it involved interviews and then tapping these international networks to actually talk with people who have been involved in illicit smuggling. And that really interests me because I've done similar stuff actually in a different region with different people who have admitted incriminating details. I'd like just to hear more about the data collection process and kind of how that works, and particularly outside of academia, because like I have to, after the IRB, I have to clear all that stuff. Talk about disclosure of privacy and these risks that can occur. I'm just curious in general what it's like doing that. Finding subjects for one, what to talk about with your subjects. I'm not sure who was doing the data collection, if it was a PI or if it was an RA or if it was a project manager. And then like just how you kind of synthesize these together to form your argument in your book.
Yeah, again, we didn't have to go through that process for this. We probably wouldn't have even attempted it, right? Because I'd probably still be waiting for clearance, but we didn't take well.
I think you're right.
And to be clear, the individual that was kind of our fixer, if you will, was not involved in the smuggling. He wasn't a smuggler and he wasn't smuggled, but he was someone who operates on the ground there fixing things, right? And has access to different people. Trying to remember the other piece of what I want to say here. So the way that we treat this, I work for the Subog Group, which is a security and intelligence consulting firm. We consider that intel, right? Intelligence, however you want to kind of label the data. So fewer obstacles and hurdles for us to get access to that. People that are kind of in our network that we've used before, we gain access to information that we would want, but that we wouldn't necessarily publish. Because we wouldn't need to. We're really just trying to find out the information. Different purposes here. So we did have an RA vetted. Again, it was the interviews were conducted in Arabic, so we had to go through, making sure the translations were accurate. We really didn't use a lot of the interview data. It was mostly kind of informed context, but we dropped a few quotes in there. Ones that we thought were particularly sexy or that might catch the reader's eye, just to show the kind of access that we had. But a lot of it stayed on the cutting room floor, didn't make it into the book, but also did help with kind of providing that context where we had a good idea of what was going on. It helped us kind of come up with a few other, I would say, ancillary hypotheses or questions to ask.
All right. Just to clarify, when this report was made into a book, who was the target audience at that point?
GISCU students. I think the publisher that we picked, Living Air, is a good combination of academics, but also kind of the layperson. I don't know how many lay people are reading about smuggling and trafficking in North Africa. Pretty niche field, admittedly. But think tanks, places like GI Talk, the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. In fact, Matt Herbert was really helpful in a lot of this. Folks like Tuesday Raitano who work there. So I guess that would be an NGO. And, really people in the field that track this stuff. One of the unfortunate parts of going from a report to a book was we had these really amazing maps made. So we had this Norwegian NGO called RIPTO, RHIPTO, which bills itself as cartographic intelligence, right? And one of the things that they were able to do was get intelligence from the ground about how trafficking and smuggling routes were changing during COVID, right? Because all of a sudden now borders aren't as porous, right? Because now we're checking everybody, or a higher percentage of people come and go from our country. And they would then reflect that in maps that were made for us at a really high level of fidelity. So printing those in black and white doesn't nearly do the justice of having that stuff. But and I'd never heard of cartographic intelligence before, but it's a really cool thing. And the maps were badass.
Eleanor, you're up.
Okay. I'm Eleanor. I'm an MPIA. Hi. I'm an MPIA SIS student, and I guess my question kind of goes back to what you were saying about how the gaps left by USAID leaving will be filled by non-state actors, but my question is, do you see any state actors coming in, and which ones?
Yeah, again, it depends where the state is strong, where the state sees an opportunity. I mentioned Hezbollah for highly sectarian nature. If you go back to the history of the Civil War, 1975 to 1990, and did through all that. But part of the reason why the Lebanese state didn't provide services to the Shia was a deliberate decision at one point, right? It was a combination of political will and also a lack of capability. So that's where the kind of sectarian, tribal, ethnic factors come into play. Are those my people, right? So look at Syria, minority Alawite running the country in a majority Sunni country. Assad for a long time neglected large parts of that country, which is, in part what led to the initial uprising in 2011. So it's a matter of, does the state now see an opportunity, or is the state so completely inept that it's just a free-for-all? And there's, active hotspots. One place I'm thinking of is Mozambique, where I've been tracking an ISIS resurgence. A lot of ethnic and sectarian issues there too. And then you also have this kind of very extractive role played by energy majors, right? Total, I think, is down there, and a bunch of others. So you have this perfect storm of factors. I think, one, I don't think the decision was well thought through. I don't think there's been any planning on anticipating second or third order effects. I think it's, well, we're over here, we're insulated. If shit goes sideways, it's not going to impact us, which I believe is incredibly myopic.
Can I ask just a brief follow-up? Do you see any other countries specifically kind of filling the gap that the U.S. is leaving? I know we see China.
Sure, right? Although even there, I don't think it's as easy as everybody says. Of the U.S., retrenches, China just takes over. China's highly active in many parts of the world through its Belt and Road Initiative. But go ask the Angolans how good roads are in China. When every rainy season they wash out, right? So China still makes shitty stuff, which is good for us, right? They still don't have the soft power. And I like to think, and maybe I'm naive, and maybe this is going to change, but most people don't want to live in a Chinese-led world order. At one point, we were referred to as the benign hegemon. I don't know how benign we are these days in the eyes of the world, particularly the global south. But I don't think it's a fait accompli that China usurps the United States. But this, I think, does accelerate us toward a more fractured, multipolar world, potentially the rise of what I would call not just great powers, but middle powers, near peers, that kind of second tier, BRICS countries, Turkey, those kind of countries stepping up and becoming bigger players within their regions.
Excellent. Thank you.
I'm Tyler. I'm a second year SIS student, and right now I'm working on a capstone project for countering violent extremism in Central Asia. So I was wondering if you could speak to any more universal insights regarding counterterrorism that you experienced in your North African research that maybe also applied to other regional hubs for violent extremism, such as Central Asia, for example.
Sure. I think one that stands out is migration, right? And I would point to use a Central Asian example to Tajikistan. As you're well aware, let's look at last March, the Crooked City Hall attack in Moscow, largely carried out by Tajiks living in Russia. And this is a diaspora community that ISIS-K has tapped into. They've specifically gone after in terms of their propaganda. They've tailored it to Tajiks, not only in terms of, their magazines being produced in Tajik language, but they've even figured out really unique things in the Tajik culture, within the Tajik culture, to appeal to Tajiks, basically masculinity and manhood, saying if you don't do this, you're not actually a real man. Whereas the message that they would send to a Southeast Asian could be different. And again, ISIS was the master of this when they were recruiting for the caliphate, because in the media, we focused on, right, in the West, if it bleeds, it leads. We were watching, people being beheaded on the nightly news. But actually, the lion's share of ISIS propaganda was positive. It was about making hijra to the caliphate for families. They showed pictures of kids fishing in the Euphrates, carnivals, all this stuff that we would never really capture unless we were digging into that. So it's incredibly sophisticated stuff. I always say, these guys have nothing on Madison Avenue, because the way that their propaganda is segmented and targeted, it's actually quite impressive. And they also recruit specifically for people with backgrounds in those areas. So I would say like the displaced migration, people from North Africa that are living elsewhere, look at the Gulf as an example of people that could be targeted for radicalization, right? Because you're working for next to no pay in pretty deplorable conditions, away from your family, which depends on your remittances. There's a lot of vulnerabilities there that, violent extremists can tap into. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Janelle Christensen, and I am teaching a global public health course this semester. So I wanted to go back to the question, was it Gwen that was asking? Was it
Eleanor?
Eleanor, I'm sorry, not even close. It's actually about the withdrawal of the U.S. and U.S. aid and how that might affect radicalization in some areas. I'm wondering what happens in areas where there are families that haven't been able to get their tuberculosis drugs in the past 2 weeks.
That might be us pretty soon too, so.
What's that?
I said that might be us here in the U.S. pretty soon,
Yes.
at this rate.
Right. And how does that, because USAID was developed in part, right, to gain people's hearts and minds. So how do you see, based on your experience, how do you see this affecting, I guess, the further destabilization and radicalization?
That's a great question. The honest answer, we don't know yet.
Yeah.
But the trends are going in a bad direction. Not to be too much of a geek here, but if you go back into the academic literature on terrorist recruitment, what do terrorist groups tend to focus on? And I know that there's no, I can hear Mia Blue in my ear telling me there's no causal link between poverty and terrorism, and to go back and read Todd Sandler, et cetera. But what I would say is that terrorist groups recruit on grievances. And there's going to be a lot more grievances now than there were before, because people are going to be destitute. They're not going to be healthy. All of the things that we've seen and that we know, groups will find a way to exploit. They might not necessarily solve the problem, but they're going to turn people's anger at those that they feel are responsible.
Eight prices.
Right. Bingo. Right. They're masters of manipulation. In many ways, at least the successful groups are, and we're giving them a lot of fodder to turn people against the United States. I mean, go back and read Joseph Nye's Soft Power, right? That was a really brilliant idea and concept for a reason, and it still is. So to pull back from that, to me, to save a couple of bucks, doesn't seem to make a whole lot of strategic sense. But again, a lot of what we're seeing now, I think, it's an adhocracy. Okay, I'm doing this. I mean, just look at Rubio's statements before he became Secretary of State. He was talking about increasing the budget of USAID so we could compete with the Chinese for access and influence in parts of these world. Then you ask him yesterday, and he's like, oh, well, I don't really mean that, right? Like, so whatever tap dancing they have to do to placate the leadership, they do. But a lot of people, even people in the administration now, have a sense that this is wrong-headed.
You mentioned the poverty and terrorism literature. Got some of my PhD students are in here, so I wanted to follow up on that, because I think it's important for us to remember that the people doing that research, the designs that they were using, right, the large N studies, and they were looking at like World Bank indicators of poverty, right, as the independent variable, and levels of terrorist attacks as the dependent variable. And then they were trying to see whether or not there were correlations, and what they came up with was no, there's no correlation. But when you're operating at such a high level of abstraction there, right, and you're just talking about correlations, there's other things that you may not be capturing, such as, within regions, within countries where you have people that, are in desperate economic situations.
Iraq is a good example. I can point you to a paper by Jake Shapiro, Patrick Johnston, and some others. Maybe it was through NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research, where they actually found evidence to support there was Iraqis that were planting IEDs for money because during debaffiliation, we told everybody with a government job and a rifle that you're now unemployed. Please go home. Instant insurgency. That's one of the we can add that. But, yeah, so I think you're right. If you look at regions and even sub-regions, you will find evidence of that. And look, it's going to wreak havoc internationally in ways that we just aren't even thinking about right now.
So, at the risk of self-promoting, I'll just say we are going to be getting into this in the terrorism course in the fall. So, look for that. Okay, Tim, you're up.
Hey, Dr. Clarke. My name's Tim Wood, first year PhD student. I study militia movements, right-wing extremism, how they call out veterans of wars to, for TTPs and all.
You watched Mike Giglio's documentary on Oath Keepers the other night?
Yeah, I'm plugged into the Oath Keepers right now in a really weird way. It's so there's like this. There's two questions here, and I think you even posted on this. There's I don't want to say new term, but it's not a new theory either. But all right, so this idea of accelerationism, right, as a symptom of our immersed society, numerous technology platforms, communication routes. You can have 20 of them to get the same message. To me, this concept doesn't seem any more different than grievance-driven precipitants and preconditions that have historically been a part of that grievance-driven violent extremist matrix. It's been the reason why individuals commit acts of violence. And just right now, in my baseline initial sort of work and interface with Oath Keepers and 3%ers, there's this concept of deputization that I think is becoming more of a realistic catalyst with
like sheriff's deputies?
Deputization of paramilitary groups to aid and assist. Like one thing that's being talked about right now is in Texas, ICE and police deputize the National Guard. And among these paramilitary groups are like, we're next. And especially in the southern border region, New Mexico, Arizona, California, and Texas, these highly armed, highly capable groups.
Essentially vigilantes.
Yes, yeah, like illegal undercurrent, like you want to break down the 1919 Militia Act.
But they consider themselves deputized.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that.
It's a great documentary, Against All Enemies, that gets into some of the stuff.
Okay. Yeah.
Fairly new.
Okay. Check it out. But yeah, I want your, would love to have your opinion on both accelerationism and then this new concept of deputization.
I don't think I'd push back too hard if you told me accelerationism was old wine and new bottles.
Okay.
The ideology itself, now it's updated for a modern setting, right? And if you spend time like I do in some of these Telegram rooms, it's got its own vernacular, its own slang. There's some really interesting stuff at ARC, the Accelerationism Research Council. Some folks are getting there. I think what's interesting and somewhat kind of new, I was having this conversation with my friend Jacob Ware recently after the Nashville shooting, which was a weird one, a self-hating Black neo-Nazi incel, right? Like, it gets into this whole salad bar ideology that former director Ray has talked about, where people are very comfortable holding different pieces of ideologies, even if those tend to be contradictory, right? So like Nick Young, the guy in Virginia who was adored neo-Nazis and Osama bin Laden. So, if you're a neo-Nazi, don't hate Muslims, okay, maybe not just Al-Qaeda guys, right? Or Devin Arthurs, the atom weapon guy that then converted to Islam and then murdered his roommates. These types of folks. But then there's also this kind of new current, and I don't know how to kind of characterize it, if it's just nihilism, if it's enemy, but if you look at like the Highland Park attack on July 4th, maybe 2 years ago, what was that ideology? The guy in the Brooklyn subway, some people would say he was a black supremacist, but there's just such a inchoate, mixture of different things that the internet has kind of brought people together in, that it's not your garden variety. You can't say that this is a far right extremist, that wants a white ethnic state. It's just a lot murkier than that. We have sadly no shortage of data points on this, but I would look into what happened in Sweden yesterday, as I'm hearing that it's another one of those cases.
That was, there even in these Telegram chat rooms, there was a member, a leader of one of these who's advocating for something that is very much like an Elonite or a communist commune economy. That's like, and then at the same time,
look at eco-fascists.
Yeah, yeah.
These are guys that have co-opted a traditionally left-wing ideal of protecting the environment, which they want to do, but they want to protect the environment to preserve it for white people. So it's like the racist twist on it, right? Like, actually, it's not climate change that's ruining, the earth, it's immigrants. Okay, how you get there, but right, so there's these really weird mixtures that I think the internet facilitates of bringing different ideas in combination, and what gets spit out of the calculator are things that we don't recognize, so we don't necessarily pay attention to them, or we come up with terms like accelerationism to help explain them, when it's really not much different than, old school anarchism. Because what's the objective for an accelerationist? To burn it to the ground. Okay, cool. After you burn it to the ground, then what? I might ask that question of people in government today as well. Yeah, hand back here.
Oh, okay, thank you. I did not, okay.
I'm Edward. I'm an undergraduate junior. Going back to the concept of the crime-terror nexus, I was curious if you observed a relationship between Middle Eastern and North African human traffickers, European organized crime, and transnational terrorism, and if that relationship may be evolving.
Outside of one-offs, we didn't see like a firm nexus, but I'm always fairly humble when it comes to researching this area, because unlike terrorists, criminals are operating surreptitiously in a way that they're not advertising what they're doing, right? Whereas terrorists are putting out propaganda, claiming credit for attacks, threatening people. It's not good for the bottom line for criminal groups. So I think we're only really seeing the tip of the iceberg. I remember I was invited to speak at the OECD in Paris back in 2015, and the whole concept was, how do we measure illicit flows, right? And most of the illicit flows we're not seeing. So it always perplexed me. Conventional wisdom is border patrol is capturing, and maybe this is outdated, 10% of what's coming across the border, right? So let's say that that's accurate, somewhat accurate. When we have a big press conference and we put record levels of dope on the table and we're patting each other on the back, doesn't that just mean more's coming across, right? Because if you're netting roughly the same percentage of what's coming across, you're putting it out there like it's a great achievement, but it really probably means that you have that much more fentanyl coming into your country now. Not that you're getting more of it, but it's just such a difficult topic when you're an academic and you like to be precise and you like to, talk about measurement, assessment, and evaluation. In this world, it's really an inexact science. Peter Andreas has a good book on it, where he talks about some of these things. And it was a fascinating conference. I mean, you had people, I presented on terrorists that fund themselves through narcotics, but there's people there talking about smuggling of kidneys, right? Like human body parts, groups in Kosovo and Turkey that were really good at that. Rare wildlife, which is something that actually Vanda, I don't know if you know Vanda Feldbad.
Oh, sure.
She's done some really good work on that. Anything that you can think that you can make money off of. I mean, look at Hezbollah, it's a good example. Yeah, these guys are smuggling Captagon, weapons, and all these other things, but in Latin America, they're also selling like counterfeit NBA jerseys and knockoff baby formula and counterfeit Viagra. Anything that they can get their hands on, they're making money on, right down in the little tri-border area.
Yeah, very entrepreneurial.
Yeah,
willing
yeah.
to, different products.
Because for them, the money is the same. They don't really
Yeah, excellent. I want to make sure, okay, Ryan, real quick, and then, go ahead.
I wanted to ask an additional question actually in terms of Hezbollah, because another point that I've been hearing as well is that Hezbollah has extensive investments within Turkey, specifically in the real estate sector. And I've done some reading in regards to the Financial Action Task Force and the sort of rating that Turkey was given, and that one of the vulnerabilities of their economy for things like terrorist financing and money laundering was specifically the real estate sector. And I wanted to know if you had any information about this or how other actors might be able to use similar systems across Europe and North Africa.
So I haven't looked into this specifically, and I can't speak to it, but I'll tell you, I thought about this, and I didn't think Hezbollah specifically, but when was the big earthquake in Turkey?
2 years ago, I think.
So part of the investigation revealed that a lot of these buildings were built with substandard building materials, right? And that made me think, well, someone's cutting corners here. Is it deliberate? Are they getting shitty knockoff materials, right? And are they getting that from a third party entity? A lot of my research, including a lot of my research when I was at RAND, was on ISIS financing. And we know that ISIS has a lot of money in Turkey at play in illicit, front companies and various businesses. Makes sense geographically, but I even remember getting a call really early on, maybe 2015, really early on in the ISIS life cycle it is, from BNY Mellon downtown. And they wanted to talk to me about what I knew at the time, which was very little, about ISIS money washing into correspondent banks in Turkey, right? Because everyone's starting to get nervous now. Hey, we don't want any bad guy money. How do we know what to look for, what not to look for? And there's a long list of legitimate entities, including some construction firms that got in hot water for dealing with the Islamic State. Yeah. So one that wouldn't surprise me. I was just in Turkey in October, actually, in Ankara. And two, it's probably being abetted by some pretty powerful people. Turkey, countries like Pakistan, the military, Iran, really control a lot of the valuable real estate. Both guys that are active and then entire generals. So if that's happening, it could be a wink, wink, nod, nod. And again, that gets to some of the kind of institutional corruption that we've been talking about so far.
Thank you. Let's pivot to something GISPF experience, right? Obviously, not just us, but many people, very nervous. But seems like every morning you wake up, there's some new crazy pronouncement, executive order, whatever the case may be. So here we are, we've invested, either 2 years of our lives or 1 year of our lives or more, getting a policy degree, and wondering, now what?
More grad school.
That's what we can tell the income is in. What a good time to get a master's degree.
Or PhD, stick around. What to say? I don't think we can be here, but we are. Probably not a good time to be thinking about going into the government. It's just one of those things, right? I'm trying to look long term, or at least beyond just the next few years. I don't think this is going to be the state of play. I hope that we recognize the error of our ways. I'll just put it on the table. I'm not a political person. I'm actually a registered independent. I'm not a partisan. I do believe we should have a smaller government. I don't think this is the way to go about it. I also think the government is very necessary in many ways. There's a way, what we need is a scalpel, and these guys have come in with a sledgehammer. So I think there are ways that you could trim fat and make government more efficient without, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. What would I do? This is going to sound kind of corny, but I even think about my career today. If you are, thank you very much. If you are passionate about what you're studying and you really wake up every day with a zeal for that and a love for it, I think you're going to end up in a good place, right? Now that you're sitting there, you're like, okay, buddy, like I'm 6 months out from applying for jobs. I was going to work at TOD, like that doesn't help. Kumbaya. So I think it's hard. This feels fairly unprecedented. Closing opportunities to work in the federal government, and I'm always heartened when I see really smart and talented people going to work in the government, because I think that's good for our country, and I still firmly believe that. I just don't know. I mean, to give an answer of like, what do you do now? You have to pay really close attention to, which way things are moving, but don't let it stop you from what you're doing. If it means, taking a job in the private sector until this stuff is sorted out, it's not the worst thing in the world.
Allegheny County's hiring.
There you go. Allegheny County, if you want to stay local. I spent 10 years at the Rand Corporation, a couple blocks from here. And it was, which is a think tank, a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank. And we were mostly working for OST and for the intelligence community. So I met some of my colleagues there are pretty nervous. Somebody was putting Rand on blast today on Twitter for NSF grants that they got, kind of mocking them, like, this is the stuff they're talking about. I have a hunch that folks that are doing this right now are going to realize at some point that they've overstepped, they've made a mistake. I think about natural disasters as a good example, because I know people that are very much about small government. They don't want the government involved in anything. And then as soon as a natural disaster hits, they're asking where the government is. Where's their support? So it's one or the other, right? There's really necessary functions that government plays. Can it be bloated and bureaucratic? Yeah, of course. But how do you kind of right-size that, right? How do you fine-tune that without completely burning it to the ground? I think that's what I would advocate rather than what we're seeing now. Again, which doesn't seem well thought out. It seems pretty knee-jerk and reactive. But become an expert in what you're here to study, right? Use this time to equip yourselves with not only knowledge, but skills, whether those are technical, quantitative skills, language skills, before you go out into the workforce. The other part is trying to get better at dealing with uncertainty. That can be tough too. If I were in your shoes right now, I might be looking at opportunities abroad, whereas beforehand I might not have been. And you never know where that could lead you. So I would say, think creatively about, your next steps, and closely monitor how things are moving. Because nobody really knows what's going to happen next.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you for
I
sharing.
wish I had a better answer than that.
No, it's good stuff. Thank you for the questions, the engagement. I also want to thank our wonderful staff that made this possible. Thinking of Zakira, Nicole, Vendi, and Kareem, and also Dean Slaughterback. Dean Slaughterback stepped up and provided important support. So thank you all, but perhaps most importantly, again, thanking our guest, Dr. Colin Clarke, for taking the time to visit and share with us. I really appreciate you taking the time to. Oh, and then we're gonna give away a copy of the
Real nice. Have everyone registered? Because the names there are only the ones who have registered.
Yeah, registered and here. But if we call someone out and they don't come up, they're gonna go to the next person.
So.
All right, excellent, great.
I've been told that if you're having trouble sleeping, it's what we do. Hoping for an endorsement from that club. Naira Sethi?
Say it again?
Naira
Naira?
Sethi?
He's not here.
Not here, winner.
Not here.
Jordan from Boston? Also, I know
George, you must. Okay. It's all register on. Wait a minute, is Jordan on Zoom?
No.
What about the first one? Okay, all right. Yes.
James,
James.
Joy? Like the zip up too?
Oh, you did?
Name like Colin Clarke?
All right, fantastic, guys. Thank you all for coming out. Thanks to our guests. And don't be afraid to follow up with your questions. And it's great to see you all. Thank you for supporting us.